Two cops pull over a black woman, thinking they can get away with anything. They arrest her, convinced she's just another person they can push around. But when they find out who she really is, their world comes crashing down. They never expected this twist. Before we get into this remarkable story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. In a small town with a history of racial profiling, the local police force had developed a reputation for biased practices. Many of the officers believed they were above the law, using their positions to control and intimidate people they deemed lesser. It was a place where justice often seemed skewed, and the power dynamics favored the officers over the very people they were supposed to protect. Judge Naomi Carter, a respected black woman, had spent years fighting against such biases. She had worked tirelessly to rise through the ranks in the legal field, gaining a reputation as a fair and determined judge. Her education and experience spoke for themselves, and she had built a career dedicated to battling systemic racism in the justice system. But on a quiet day, her life would take an unexpected turn. Two officers, Officer Ryan and Officer Evans, known for their discriminatory behavior, pulled Judge Carter over for what seemed like a minor violation. They didn't recognize her, but their bias took over. Instead of treating her with respect, they assumed she was just another person they could push around. Their assumptions led them to escalate the situation unnecessarily, arresting her over something trivial and making a decision they would soon regret. Officer Ryan and Officer Evans stood confidently, assuming they were in control of the situation. Judge Naomi Carter had been pulled over for what they believed was a minor traffic violation, and, in their minds, it was just another case of a civilian trying to avoid the law. It was just another opportunity for them to flex their power. They had no idea who they were dealing with. When they began to escalate the situation unnecessarily, Carter, who had been calm throughout the entire ordeal, knew exactly what was happening. The officers assumed they could push her around, treating her with the same disrespect they had shown countless others. But this time, it was different. They didn't know that the person they were messing with wasn't just some random driver. They had just arrested a powerful, respected judge who was about to turn the tables on them. The officers kept pressing, raising their voices, making unnecessary threats. But Carter's composure never wavered. She had dealt with far worse in her career, and this situation, though frustrating, was not going to rattle her. She had seen discrimination in its many forms, and though she knew the officers were just doing their job, their assumptions had pushed her too far. As they continued with their aggressive behavior, Carter remained calm and composed. It was then that she decided to put an end to their arrogance. Slowly, she pulled out her ID, flashing it just enough to make sure they could see it clearly. "I am Judge Naomi Carter," she said quietly, her voice steady, yet full of authority. "And I will be presiding over your case." The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. The officers froze. They were still standing, but it was as if time had slowed down for them. Officer Ryan blinked, staring at the ID in disbelief as if trying to process what was happening. He glanced at Officer Evans, who had gone pale, his earlier confidence gone. They had just arrested a judge, someone who not only outranked them but who had the power to make their lives incredibly difficult. They didn't just mess with a random civilian. They had made the mistake of assuming someone they could intimidate was just like any other person they had bullied before. Ryan cleared his throat, but the words didn't come out right away. He glanced nervously at Evans, who was now avoiding Carter's gaze. Carter didn't speak again immediately. She let them process the information, knowing that this moment of realization would hit harder than anything she could say. The officers, once so full of themselves, now stood awkwardly. They had gone from a position of power to one of vulnerability in the blink of an eye. Their arrogance, the assumption that they could act with impunity, had now come back to bite them. They had no idea who they were dealing with when they decided to escalate things. Finally, Ryan found his voice. I didn't know. I didn't recognize you." His voice trailed off, and the confidence he once had was now replaced by fear. He began to backpedal, but his attempts to apologize were unconvincing. "I'm sorry, Judge Carter. We didn't mean to cause any harm." Carter, unshaken, watched the officers scramble, clearly feeling the weight of their error. She wasn't in the mood for pity or empty apologies. She had dealt with injustice her entire life, and while she understood the reality of bias, this was different. They had crossed a line, and now they were facing the consequences. "I'm sure you didn't," Carter replied coldly, her voice laced with a firm, unyielding tone. "But your actions have consequences. Do you think your badge gives you the right to treat anyone like this?" The officers stood in silence. They didn't know how to respond. They were caught in a situation that was completely out of their control. What had started as a routine traffic stop had now spiraled into a nightmare for them. They realized just how deeply their bias had clouded their judgment, and they were paying the price for it. For a brief moment, the power was on their side, but it was slipping away fast. Carter, knowing exactly how to handle the situation, made sure that they understood exactly what they had done. She had seen this kind of bias before. She knew how it played out, how officers like them assumed their position allowed them to disregard the rights of others. But she also knew that it was never too late for someone to learn. "Officer Ryan, Officer Evans," Carter continued, her voice calm but filled with the authority of someone who had earned her position. "I will be the judge presiding over your case, and I'll make sure that your actions are fully investigated. The fact that you've let your bias get the best of you will not be ignored." The officers stood there, utterly stunned, as Carter calmly dialed the necessary numbers to report the incident. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. These officers needed to understand that their behavior had consequences, no matter who they tried to intimidate. They couldn't hide behind their badges forever. As Carter made the call, the weight of the situation became clear to both officers. They had thought they could arrest anyone without consequences, but now they were about to learn that even those who thought they were above the law had to face the truth. Carter had made sure of that. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Officer Ryan and Officer Evans, once so confident, now stood frozen at the front. What had started as a routine arrest, one they assumed they could get away with, had quickly turned into a nightmare they couldn't escape. They had walked into this courtroom as defendants, not even realizing the gravity of what they had done. And now, as they stood there, they were about to face the very woman they had wrongly targeted. Judge Naomi Carter sat on the bench, her eyes fixed on the two officers. The confidence they had once radiated was now replaced with visible discomfort. The two officers shifted their weight from foot to foot, glancing nervously at each other as they tried to make sense of the situation. The truth that had been slowly dawning on them now hit like a freight train. They had arrested someone far more powerful than they ever imagined. Ryan's face had gone pale, his earlier arrogance completely gone. His eyes darted around the courtroom trying to find an escape from the reality of the moment. He couldn't believe it. He had no idea who Judge Carter was when they pulled her over. Now, standing in front of her, he realized the magnitude of the mistake he had made. Evans, too, seemed to shrink under the weight of the situation. They had assumed that they were above the law, that they could use their badges to get away with anything. But now, the law was staring them in the face. "Judge Carter," Ryan started, his voice trembling. "We didn't know. We thought—" "You thought," Carter interrupted calmly, her voice cutting through his panic. "You assumed I was just another person you could arrest without a second thought. And now, here you are in front of me, facing the consequences of your actions." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of experience in the legal system. She had seen this kind of behavior before, but now she had the power to hold these officers accountable. Evans began to stammer, trying to salvage some semblance of control. "We didn't mean to. We thought—" "You thought," Carter repeated, her tone firm but not angry. "You thought that because you wore a badge, you could do whatever you wanted. You thought because of who I am, well, who you thought I was, that you could get away with it. But now you're here, and the truth is out." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes piercing through them as the courtroom waited for the next move. The audience, including the other officers who had been quietly watching, exchanged looks. Some were in disbelief, others in shock, but all of them were witnessing something they would never forget. For many of them, it was the first time they'd seen a black woman in such a position of power, someone who had the ability to take down two officers who had once believed they could do no wrong. Ryan and Evans continued to fumble for words, but it was clear the moment was slipping away from them. They had no excuse, no justification that could fix the damage they had caused. The longer they tried to explain themselves, the more the truth was obvious to everyone in the room. They were guilty, and no amount of scrambling would change that. "Officer Ryan, Officer Evans," Carter said, her voice cold and authoritative. "You have treated people like this before. You assumed I was just another person you could disrespect. You thought you could get away with it. But now, you're going to answer for it." The room fell silent, the weight of Carter's words hanging in the air. The officers' attempts to justify their actions had only exposed their own insecurities and bias. Their faces turned crimson with shame as they realized that Carter wasn't just a judge in this courtroom. She was the very person they had targeted because of their assumptions. And now, their fate was in her hands. The officers tried to keep their composure, but their voices had lost their earlier force. "Please, Judge Carter," Ryan said, his voice quieter now. "We didn't know. We didn't mean any harm." Carter's eyes never left them. "It's not enough to say you didn't mean harm. Your actions speak louder than your words." She turned to address the courtroom, her voice steady. "Racial profiling has consequences. This behavior will no longer be tolerated." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone, from the other officers to the audience, was watching as Judge Carter held the two officers accountable for their actions. The power had shifted completely. The two officers who had once stood so confidently now stood in front of her, realizing they had crossed a line. The very people they had been prejudiced against were now in positions of authority. They were no longer the ones in control. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It was clear that Carter was not only here to ensure that justice was served, but to send a message that prejudice and bias would no longer be allowed to corrupt the system. As the officers stood there, frozen in place, they knew their careers were over. It was no longer a matter of whether they could escape the consequences. It was a matter of how badly they would be held accountable for their actions. The realization that they had targeted the wrong person, and that their wrongdoings were about to be exposed to the world, sank in. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the weight of the decision settled over everyone. Officer Ryan and Officer Evans stood there, their careers hanging by a thread. Their once unstoppable confidence had been shattered, and now they were facing the very judge they had underestimated. The consequences of their actions were no longer just theoretical. They were about to face the full force of accountability. As the judge finished her statement, a sense of finality filled the room. The officers had no choice but to face the fact that their actions, their prejudices, would no longer be overlooked. The power they had once wielded over others, believing they could act with impunity, had been taken away from them in an instant. The law, in the form of Judge Naomi Carter, was now holding them accountable for their racial profiling. The case became a turning point not just for the officers, but for the entire town. News of the incident spread quickly, and public outcry soon followed. Citizens who had once turned a blind eye to the corruption within the police force began to speak out, demanding change. The conversation about racial bias in law enforcement, that had been whispered behind closed doors for years, was now out in the open. The department couldn't ignore the pressure. An internal investigation was launched, and both officers were placed under immediate scrutiny. The entire police force was forced to review its practices, from how officers were trained to how they treated people of color. The department was shaken to its core, and it became clear that systemic change was the only way forward. No longer could biased behavior be swept under the rug. The department had to rebuild its relationship with the community and regain the trust it had lost over the years. Judge Carter didn't shy away from her role in these reforms. She remained steadfast, using her position not only to preside over cases, but also to advocate for necessary changes within the system. While she had been wronged, she didn't seek vengeance. Instead, she saw the bigger picture, the need to create a justice system where no one, regardless of their race, would be treated unfairly. She understood that lasting change required more than just one case. It required a complete overhaul of how law enforcement interacted with the community. Her actions proved that power and authority could be used for good. It wasn't just about having the ability to punish those who had done wrong. It was about using that power to ensure fairness, transparency, and justice for all. Judge Carter became a symbol of what was possible when someone in a position of influence refused to let bias or corruption go unchecked. As the investigation into Officer Ryan and Officer Evans continued, it became clear that the case was just the beginning. The reforms that followed were far-reaching, affecting not just the officers involved but also the way the entire department functioned. New policies were put in place, focusing on de-escalation techniques, implicit bias training, and greater accountability for officers' actions. There was a shift in the culture of the police force, one that had been needed for far too long. For Judge Carter, the work wasn't over. She continued to serve in her role, but now she was more determined than ever to make sure that the legal system served everyone equally. She didn't let the spotlight or the attention from her actions distract her from the work ahead. Every day, she fought for justice, not just in the courtroom but in the broader systems that needed reform. The case of Officer Ryan and Officer Evans became a landmark moment, one that would be remembered for years to come. It was a reminder that even in a system often resistant to change, accountability could still prevail, and that when those in power were held responsible for their actions, justice had a chance to thrive. When the truth comes to light, it can change everything, in an instant. What seemed impossible just moments before can be turned upside down. Judge Naomi Carter's story is a perfect example of that. The officers who thought they could get away with their bias never saw it coming. They were convinced they could silence someone only to realize the truth, and the consequences were far more powerful than their assumptions. This case wasn't just about one judge. It was about standing up to injustice and showing that no matter how much power you think you have, the truth always finds a way to shine through. When Judge Carter revealed who she really was, the officers couldn't hide behind their badges anymore. The law was on her side, and the system worked, something that's often easier said than done. Have you ever seen someone get justice when it seemed impossible? Maybe you watched as someone who was wronged finally had their day in court, or when a system that seemed broken started to change. It's a powerful feeling when justice prevails against all odds. For Judge Carter, it wasn't just about her own case. It was about showing others that they, too, could stand up for what's right, no matter who was trying to hold them down. Share your story in the comments below. What's a moment where you saw someone finally get the justice they deserved, even when it seemed out of reach? If you want to hear more stories about justice prevailing, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more.